Earp was. You know all about Doc Holliday and the gunfight at the OK Corral. But who was Johnny Ringo, that brooding, troubled killer, known to some as the gentleman gunslinger? This deadly man was said to have been fluent in Latin and could also quote Shakespeare. So join me as we look into who Johnny Ringo really was, what happened in his life that made him become such a deadly gunman, and how did he really die? Was he really killed by Doc Holliday as is portrayed in the movie Tombstone? And while we're at it, let's do a little bit of Tombstone fact versus fiction on this newest You're a Daisy If You Do episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. John Peter Ringo was born on May 3rd, 1850 in Wayne County, Indiana. By the way, before we go any further, I know for a fact I'm going to accidentally slip up and call him Ringo Starr. If I don't catch it while I'm editing, just know this is about the infamous gunman Johnny Ringo and not about the drummer for the Beatles. Okay, John Ringo, or Johnny as he would later be called, moved with his family to Gatlin, Missouri in 1856. Fun fact, he's loosely related to the infamous Younger brothers of the James Younger gang fame through marriage. No record of him ever meeting them though, as far as I could tell. Ringo's family moved again in 1864 when he was just 14 years old, and it was during this move that he'd lose his father. While en route to California, Johnny's father, Martin Ringo, accidentally shot himself in the head with a shotgun as he was stepping down off a wagon. Yikes. Yep, that'll do it. Nothing like a shotgun blast in the head to make that long goodnight a reality. The Liberty Tribune wrote of this event, quote, "His shotgun went off accidentally in his hands, the load entering his right eye and coming out the top of his head. At the report of the gun, I saw his hat blow up 20 feet in the air, and his brains were scattered in all directions." Ugh. Like most Western migrants would do, Ringo's family would bury their patriarch right there on the side of the trail. Numerous trailside graves marked the way west. But your surviving relatives would just have to keep on moving, which they did, eventually arriving in San Jose, California, which is where Johnny Ringo spent his adolescent years, between 1864 and 1870. And we don't really know much about this time of Ringo's life. You know, there's rumors that he was a damn juvenile delinquent and found a fondness for hard liquor, but I'm not aware of him really doing anything to get crossways of the law at a young age. Those rumors would match up with his actions later in life, though. Johnny left home around the age of 20. He's listed on the California census in 1870 as a farmer, but his sister would later claim that he departed the area as part of a harvesting team sometime in late 1870 and early 1871. So now we're talking. We're in the heart of the Wild West now. Somehow he found himself in Burnett, Texas, where he got in trouble for discharging a firearm in a public square. He then drifted a little west of there to Mason County, Texas, and got balls deep in the Mason County War, also known as the Hoodoo War. Just one of the many bloody feuds that would take place in Texas during the 1870s. So Mason County is in central Texas, about 100 miles or so north of San Antonio. If you're not from Texas or you've never visited the central part of Texas, you may not know that a large portion of that part of the state was settled by German immigrants. So in the 1870s especially, that area would have had a huge population of Germans. It wasn't long before they started clashing with the local ranchers, many of whom were veterans of the Civil War and not about to be pushed around by some damn kolache-eating Krauts. In 1872, the German-backed sheriff John Clark formed a posse in an attempt to try to stop some of the rustling in the area. The cattle rustling was so bad in Mason County that the presiding justice contacted the governor of Texas requesting that troops be sent to the area to help deal with the issue. Even still, the citizens were fed up and took the law into their own hands. A mob of about 40 men broke into the jail, took 5 suspected cattle thieves from their cells, and lynched them. This, of course, brought more violence. Eventually, a local man named Scott Cooley got involved. And this dude, holy shit, I should be doing a podcast on him instead. Scott Cooley was orphaned as a child after his parents were killed by Native Americans. He was then adopted by a local rancher named Tim Williamson. Tim and his wife, whose name I couldn't find, raised Scott as their own, even nursing him through a bad case of the typhoid. Scott would grow up to become a Texas Ranger, earning one hell of a reputation as someone you did not want coming after you. He also stayed pretty close to his adopted family, the Williamsons. He even helped Tim Williamson make a couple of cattle drives up north to Kansas. But on May 13, 1875, Tim Williamson was arrested by Sheriff's Deputy John Worley on suspicion of cattle rustling. And as he was being escorted to the jail, a mob of angry Germans captured him and shot him dead. And the Texas Ranger Scott Cooley was said to have broken down sobbing uncontrollably when he found out the news. Adopted or not, he loved this man like a father, and there's no way he's going to let these German fucks get by with his murder. But just like his name suggests, he kept his coolie. Ha! Get it? Dead joke coming in hot. He didn't just go off all half-cocked. He wanted to see if the law would do anything about it. And of course they didn't. The indictments never came, so he did eventually take matters into his own hands. And his first target was the sheriff's deputy who arrested Williamson. He believed Deputy Worley was in on it, he was complicit, and they'd been working with the men who killed his adopted father. Cooley, along with a posse of men, including Johnny Ringo, Johnny Ringo, went to Deputy Worley's home and shot him dead. Cooley then scalped Worley, proudly displaying the bloody scalp to the German citizens. "Where's the mob now, motherfuckers?" Then they tracked down and killed Peter Bader. Unfortunate name, by the way. There's no way you have the last name Bader and not be given the nickname Master in junior high. Anyway, Cooley and Ringo gunned down Peter Master Bader, who was believed to have been Williamson's killer, as well as killing another man named Daniel Horster, whom they suspected of having been part of the ambush group. Things are really heating up now, oh boy. The Germans retaliated with a posse led by Sheriff Clark and ambushed a couple of Cooley's associates, which led Cooley and his group, including Johnny Ringo, to kill some of the ambushers, which led to two of Cooley's group being hanged, and so on and so fucking forth. You killed my friend, I'm gonna kill yours. This shit went on for a little bit. The sheriff refused to do anything about the German lynch mobs, and the Texas Rangers refused to go after Scott Cooley and his gang, because Scott was one of their own and highly respected. Actually, to the point that 7 Texas Rangers quit rangering because they refused to do their duty and pursue their friend Cooley. The killings ramped up at this point and just got kind of random, with Johnny Ringo in the mix the entire time. Cooley and Ringo were finally arrested in Burnett County, Texas for threatening the life of a deputy sheriff, but they were able to escape. "Look here, Mr. Law Dog, law don't go around here, savvy." Their arrest did succeed in stopping the violence in Mason County, though. Cooley escaped a posse near the Llano River, fled into Blanco County, Texas, and just disappeared. Nobody knows for sure what happened to him. Some say he was wounded by the posse and later died of those wounds, but others say he was holed up in the Nimitz Hotel in Fredericksburg and died of a brain fever. There's another story that says he was possibly poisoned to death. Either way, the Mason County War was over. Scott Cooley was dead, probably, and Johnny Ringo was headed to Arizona. Tombstone, Arizona. How about this Scott Cooley guy, man? He's the type I love learning about. I never even heard about him before I started doing research for this episode. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say you've probably never heard of him either. Badass, highly reputable Texas Ranger who went on a vengeance spree against the corrupt ranchers and lawmen that were responsible for his adopted father's death. Now that would make a good movie. But Josh, what's all the bullshit? Let's get to Johnny Ringo. I'm gonna take a chill pill. Well, you got somewhere to be? Sit back, relax, close your eyes, breathe. Hey, get your hands out of your pants. I saw that. Not cool, man. We're doing a fucking podcast. Not cool. Anyway, I don't know when Johnny Ringo became a killer. By 1876, when the Mason County War ended and Cooley either disappeared or died, Ringo was 26 years old. Was the Mason County War his first taste of combat, or had he, previously been involved in killings? No idea. He was arrested for one of the killings he committed in Mason County, but no witnesses would come forward and testify against him, so all charges were dropped. By the way, when he was locked up on this murder charge, one of his cellmates allegedly was John Wesley Hardin, who I covered way back in episode 9 of Bloody Beaver podcast. And believe it or not, after being released from jail, Johnny Ringo would spend a brief amount of time as a lawman himself, as a constable in Loyal Valley, Texas. So many of these guys worked both sides of the law. So many respected lawmen ended up in their own jails or hung by lynch mobs, and so many outlaws and killers would go on to wear the badge themselves. Texas in the 1870s, man, that shit was crazy. By 1879, Johnny Ringo is no longer a constable, and he's found his way to Arizona, where he drunkenly shot a guy for refusing his offer of a shot of whiskey. The man he shot, Lewis Hancock, would go on to survive, but Ringo was already developing a reputation as a mean-tempered drunk. It's funny, I've personally seen 2 fights, or near fights, break out over this exact same thing. Some loud, drunk asshole wants to buy someone he doesn't even know a shot, and the other guy just says, "No thanks, I'm good. Just enjoying my beer." And then the drunk guy will get all offended. It's like, "What? You too good for my shot? Well, fuck you then." And then, stuff goes down. Like I said, I've seen it happen twice. I don't understand the mentality behind it. If you can't handle your shit, stay home. Around this same time, Ringo started associating with a little group known as the Cochise County Cowboys. Oh, shit. Here we go. Let's get into the good stuff. I know all of y'all listening have probably already seen the movie Tombstone, but for those who haven't, I feel like I should point out that these weren't traditional cowboys. What they were was a loose federation of cattle rustlers and thieves that operated around the Cochise County area. Tombstone resident George Parsons wrote in his diary, quote, "Cowboy is a rustler at times, and a rustler is a synonym for desperado, bandit, outlaw, and horse thief." The San Francisco Examiner wrote in an editorial, quote, "Cowboys are the most reckless class of outlaws in that wild country, infinitely worse than the ordinary robber. Legal cowmen were usually landowners and generally called herders or ranchers." An article in the Tombstone Epitaph, published in 1881, stated, quote, "It has come to pass in this country that life and personal property are unsafe. Even in the town of Tombstone, it seems that one of the leading industries is to be destroyed. There is not a teamster today who is not in fear and dread of the cowboys. are so styled rustlers, depriving him of his hard earnings. How do such men feel to be robbed by a hand of thieves and cutthroats who take pride in announcing to the public that they are rustlers? Where is the Teamsters' protection? Can you find any officers who will follow, arrest, or recover your property? If you can, I'd like to see them. These chaps seem to have no difficulty evading the law, while others, not inclined to work, daily join the band, and they are increasing fast in numbers. Our town is filled with spies watching every move of the officers and imparting their information to their comrades. So yeah, these are the type of people Ringo started hanging out with when he got to Arizona. And this cowboy group wasn't just some small gang like, Billy the Kid's Regulators or Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. Most estimates I found place the Cowboys as having anywhere between 200 to 300 members and associates. Their numbers included famous bad men such as Curly Bill Brocious, the Clanton brothers, Frank and Tom McLaury, outlaws Frank Stillwell and Pony Deal, and of course Johnny Ringo. The area they operated in was also the home of Tombstone, a silver mining boomtown whose population grew from 100 residents to over 14,000. Within 2 years of its founding, Tombstone boasted of a bowling alley, 4 churches, an ice house, a school, 2 banks, an ice cream parlor, but that felt good in that Arizona heat, along with 110 saloons, 14 gambling halls, and a shit ton of brothels. 4 churches versus 110 saloons. I think it's safe to say that both the Devil and the Cowboys felt right at home in Tombstone. As would happen with these boomtowns, they'd be a beacon for gamblers, con artists, pimps, derelicts, outlaws, and all sorts of vagrant types. And many of these types would move with the boomtowns and often ended up in the same towns at the same time. Doc Holliday spent some time in Deadwood, another boomtown, before he arrived in Tombstone. So did Wyatt Earp. He and his brother Morgan graced Deadwood with their presence before hitting up Tombstone. Now, before we go any further, I know I'm going to get somebody saying that the Cowboys weren't as bad as they were made out to be, and that the Earps were no better than outlaws themselves. This is a debate that will never be settled. And due to time constraints, I'm not going to get into that on this episode. That might be a good future episode, was Wyatt Earp a good man or a bad man? What he was a tough man, and so were his brothers. They didn't mind settling things with their fists or their guns, and neither did Johnny Ringo and his cowboy friends. Both sides were destined to clash. 2 toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight. Yeah, I just hit y'all with that quote. Who said that? Huh? Anyone? Powers Booth, that's who. The amazing actor who played Curly Bill Brocious in Tombstone. And he said that in the 1980s Cold War movie, Red Dawn. He also played Cy Tolliver in the Deadwood TV show. Fuck yeah, see how I bring things around full circle for y'all? It's because I care. I really do. Back to Johnny Ringo. In 1881, he held up a poker game at gunpoint and stole $500. He was brought to Tombstone to stand trial for this robbery. Before the trial, however, he got into a little heated incident with the Earps and their friend Doc Holliday. It seems that Ringo was pissed off about the Earps supposedly starting a rumor that he was involved in a recent stagecoach robbery. You remember that scene from Tombstone? A drunk Johnny Ringo confronts Wyatt and his older brother Virgil, stating that he wants their blood and he wants their souls and he wants them now. The Earps refuse to take the bait, but Doc Holliday is ready to play. That's just his game. I'm your Huckleberry, he tells Ringo, to which Ringo replies, I'm your what? Huckleberry, Holliday repeats. What the fuck is a huckleberry? Ringo then asks Holliday. Holliday then states they're like blueberries but only bigger and a little more tart. They're also the state fruit of Idaho. Ringo is now getting visibly frustrated and tells Holliday that he knows what a fucking huckleberry is and that they're delicious and all that, but I'm out here talking about taking souls and you're bringing up fruit. What the fuck are you talking about, Longer? Holliday replied, honestly, I don't know. It's just something I like to say before I get into a gunfight because I think it sounds cool. I know it makes zero sense, but when I say I'm your huckleberry with my deep molasses dripping Georgia accent, I feel like it's somewhat intimidating. I do appreciate you asking me, Johnny Ringo, because I've never given it much thought before. Maybe I need to reflect on, fucking shut the fuck up already, Longer, Ringo yelled. Throw down or shut your mouth because honestly, dude, you're not even making any sense right now. To which Holliday replied, you're a daisy if you do. A frustrated Johnny Ringo, now just face flushed red with rage, finally goes for his gun, but not before being grabbed from behind and dragged off, thus avoiding bloodshed. Those of you who've seen Tombstone know that almost everything I just said was bullshit. Those of you who haven't seen Tombstone are either extremely confused or you stopped listening a couple minutes ago. The truth is that Johnny Ringo did have a confrontation with the Earps as well as Doc Holliday. He really was about to throw down with Holliday just like in the movie Tombstone, but instead of Curly Bill Brocious grabbing him from behind, it was a member of law enforcement. And both men would spend a little bit of time in jail over the incident. The situation in Tombstone was getting tense. The city marshal was actually murdered by Curly Bill Brocious. By the way, City Marshal Fred White was only 31 years old when he was killed, in stark contrast to the character that portrayed him on Tombstone, who was a white-haired older gentleman. On June 28, 1881, Virgil Earp took over the position as marshal. He hired his brother Morgan as a deputy and would occasionally call on Wyatt to assist him. And one of the town ordinances that he was to enforce was Tombstone City Ordinance Number 9, which read, "To provide against the carrying of deadly weapons. Section 1. It is hereby declared unlawful to carry in the hand or upon the person, or otherwise, any deadly weapon within the limits of said city of Tombstone, without further obtaining a permit in writing. Section 2. This prohibition does not extend to persons immediately leaving or entering the city, with good faith and within reasonable time, are proceeding to deposit or take from the place of deposit such deadly weapons. Section 3. All firearms of every description and bowie knives and dirks are included within the prohibition of this ordinance." And it's this ordinance as well as the simmering tension that led to the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. Things had been brewing for a while and finally came to a head on October 26, 1881, when Virgil Earp, along with brothers Morgan and Wyatt and friend Doc Holliday, attempted to disarm and arrest cowboys Tom and Frank McLaury, Billy and Ike Clanton, and Billy Claiborne. Things quickly escalated and shots were fired. When the gun smoke cleared, Virgil and Morgan were wounded, Holliday was grazed by a bullet, and Billy Clanton, as well as the McLaury brothers, were dead. The lawmen were initially arrested and charged with murder after this incident, but they were later released after evidence supported that they were acting within the law. And that's up for debate, but we don't have time to dissect it on this episode. If you want to know more about the legalities of it and whether or not the Earps were justified, check out a recent episode of the High Crimes and History podcast titled The Line in the Sand, The Trial at the OK Corral. I just discovered this podcast and listened to this episode recently, and holy shit, it's good. This guy researches, and he goes deep, so check it out for more information. 2 months after the fight at the OK Corral, Virgil Earp was ambushed in a murder attempt by the Cowboys. And while badly wounded, he was not killed. A few months later, another Earp was targeted for murder, and this time it was successful. A gunman fired from a dark alley and killed Morgan Earp. Wyatt Earp, now a deputy U.S. Marshal for Cochise County, did the same thing that Scott Cooley did. He took matters into his own hands. He was out for blood. He went on a vendetta ride, targeting members of the Cowboys when and where he could find them. You remember what Wyatt said in Tombstone? "All right, Clanton, you called down the thunder, well now you got it. See that?" As he showed his badge. It says United States Marshal. The Cowboys are finished, you understand me? I see a red sash, I killed a man wearing it. So run, you cur, run! Tell all the other curs the law is coming. You tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me. You hear? Hell's coming with me! Oh, it's such a good movie. Is there a more quotable movie than Tombstone? Also, I think probably my downstairs neighbors now think I'm an insane person. I hope they don't call the cops. Okay. By the way, the Cowboys didn't wear red sashes around their waists. Looked really cool in the movie, but entirely made up. Who cares though, man? You know, the Scottish didn't wear kilts in the time of William Wallace, but Braveheart was still a badass movie. And there's no record of Wyatt saying any of that cool stuff I just said. But the outcome was the same. He and his posse did bring the thunder and rain down hell on the Cowboys. This posse included Wyatt and his brother Warren, Texas Jack Vermillion, and increasingly sick Doc Holliday. I keep referring to him as Lunger. He was dying of tuberculosis at this point. Turkey Creek Johnson and Sherman McMaster rounded out the group. They were able to track down and kill several members of the Cowboys, including Curly Bill, who was a close friend of Johnny Ringo. Another man they killed was Florentino Cruz. And before Cruz died, he allegedly told Earp that Curly Bill and Ringo were among Morgan Earp's killers. This info comes from Wyatt Earp himself. Modern historians do cast doubts upon these claims. So while the Earp posse was federally deputized, they were also now wanted by local law enforcement for the killing of a cowboy named Frank Stillwell. Cochise County Sheriff Behan formed his own posse to pursue and arrest the Earps, and he deputized a number of the outlaw cowboys while doing so, including our very own Johnny Ringo, once again wearing a badge, just constantly crossing that line from outlaw to lawman. You know, these terms were almost interchangeable in the Old West. While Behan's posse greatly outnumbered that of Earp's, he never really caught up with them. Sheriff Behan was sympathetic to the Cowboys, whereas the Earps had the backing and support of many of the local businesses and ranchers who weren't affiliated with the Cowboys. At one point, Earp made his location known and publicly challenged Behan to come and find him. Behan didn't. In April of 1882, Earp and his men fled Arizona. Well, I shouldn't say they fled. They left Arizona. Earp had gotten his revenge, and Sheriff Behan was either too incompetent or too scared to catch up with him. About a month later, Johnny Ringo left Tombstone. He had been exonerated of any crimes he may have committed with the back and forth between the Cowboys and the Earps. And then on July 14, 1882, the body of Johnny Ringo was found lying against the trunk of a large tree in West Turkey Creek Valley near Chiricahua Peak in Arizona. He was 32 years old. He had a single bullet wound in his right temple and his pistol was in his hand. So who killed Johnny Ringo? According to an official coroner's inquest, his death was ruled as suicide. Did Johnny Ringo kill himself? Okay, so there's a few theories. I'll share them with you, and then I'll tell you which one I think is most likely the truth. First, there's the Doc Holliday theory. This was popularized by the movie Tombstone. The idea was that Johnny Ringo called out Wyatt Earp, and Doc stepped in and took Ringo out on White's behalf. Say when, I'm your Huckleberry. The problem with this theory is that Holliday was like 700 miles away at this time. And he was a wanted man in Arizona. I just find it highly unlikely that he'd go back to Arizona, sick and all that, and risk being arrested just to take out Johnny Ringo. The next theory is that Wyatt Earp killed Ringo. It's sort of the same as the Holliday theory. Wyatt was not in Arizona at the time of Ringo's death. Unfortunately, this theory has gained some traction because Wyatt once claimed to have killed Johnny Ringo. And then he later on denied it. And then years later, he claimed it again. Dude, you're fucking Wyatt Earp. Stop lying, man. We know you're already a badass. Why lie about killing Ringo? And then there's a guy by the name of Michael O'Rourke, also known as Johnny Behind the Deuce. He was arrested in Tucson, Arizona in January of 1881 on suspicion of murdering a mining engineer named Henry Schneider. Wyatt Earp is said to have protected him from being lynched by a mob organized and led by Ringo Starr. I said it, Ringo Starr. Led by Johnny Ringo. O'Rourke escaped from jail in April of 1881 and never stood trial on the murder charges. He was last seen not far from Tombstone in the Dragoon Mountains and was said to have been well mounted and well equipped. And he was headed out of the territory. So much like the Earp and Holliday theories, you'd have to assume that he hated Ringo so much that he returned to Arizona with a murder warrant hanging over his head just to kill this man. And then there's Buckskin Frank Leslie. I might do a podcast on him one day. He was an Army scout, a gambler, gunfighter, a con man, you name it. And while in prison, he confided in a guard that he was the one who killed Johnny Ringo. Many people think he was just trying to garner favor in the Wyatt Earp inner circle, but there's an unverifiable story that claims that Billy Claiborne, a participant of the fight at the OK Corral, told people that he saw Frank Leslie kill Ringo. So what's going on here? Who's telling the truth? Let's break it down a little bit more. After leaving Tombstone, he shortly returned and spoke with the editor of the Tombstone Epitaph, a newspaper, and he was quoted as saying that he was certain of being killed as he was of living. He said that he might run along for a couple years more and may not last 2 days. Okay, so that's ominous. There were 4th of July celebrations going on, and Ringo was said to have been drinking heavily. When he finally left town a few days later, he left with a couple extra bottles of whiskey. He was then seen 2 days later, still drinking and still drunk. Deputy Billy Breckenridge met up with him on the trail and was quoted as saying, "It was shortly after noon. Ringo was very drunk, reeling in the saddle, and said he was going to Galeville. It was in the summer and a very hot day. He offered me a drink out of a half-filled bottle of whiskey, and he had another full bottle. I tasted it, and it was too hot to drink. It burned my lips. Knowing that he would have to ride nearly all night before he got to Galeville, I tried to get him to go back with me to the Goodrich Ranch and wait until after sundown. But he was drunk and stubborn and went on his way. I think this was the last time he was seen alive." The afternoon before his body was found, a local rancher heard a single gunshot around 3 p.m. And it was the next day when his body was discovered. By the way, his horse wasn't with him. It was found miles away, still saddled, with Ringo's boots hanging off the saddle. Common practice in those days to keep scorpions and shit out of your boots. His feet were wrapped in a torn shirt, indicating that his horse got away from him, and he, bootless, attempted to catch up with it. The shirt was to protect his feet from the rough terrain. The cartridge belt around his waist was on upside down. So I personally think Ringo killed himself. Here's what I think went down based on the evidence I've seen. Who was he? He certainly wasn't as bad as guys like Boone Helm or John Wesley Hardin, who I previously covered. He wasn't an out-and-out murderer, from what I've read, although he could get pretty reckless, and he did wear the badge of law enforcement a couple of times in his life. But at the same time, he was constantly getting into fights, constantly in and out of jail, being brought up on charges. At first, I was thinking maybe he was so drunk that he fell off his horse and just passed out. But that wouldn't explain the boots. Nobody rides a horse without boots on. So here's my theory on the death of Johnny Ringo. I think he stopped at camp, drunk off his ass, took off his boots and his cartridge belt, and fell asleep before he unsaddled his horse. I think he woke up the next day either still drunk or extremely hungover, and since he didn't bother to unsaddle his horse, of course he didn't bother to hobble it, so it was gone, along with his boots and whatever else was in his saddlebags. It's a bitch to be that hungover. Even if you wake up in a nice comfy bed with the AC blasting and plenty of ibuprofen, coffee, and water. Now imagine you're him and you wake up in that condition laying on the ground in Arizona. That stifling heat, the parched lips, the dry throat, your head pounding, and now your horse is gone. I think he got up, put his belt on upside down just due to being so fucking hungover, probably suffering from a migraine, extremely dehydrated, and attempted to find his horse. Socks offer very little protection from the desert floor, so he tore his undershirt up and wrapped his feet with it. And when he couldn't find his horse, I think he sat down at the base of that tree and finally said, enough is enough. He pulled his pistol out, cocked back the hammer, pressed it against his forehead, and pulled the trigger. I think Johnny Ringo was simply tired. Tired of living and trying to figure shit out. Tired of fighting his demons. I think he had enough. But that's just me. These are my thoughts. We'll never know exactly what happened during Johnny Ringo's final hours. It does seem like suicide is probably the most logical explanation. It's also important to note that several people did state that they saw this coming, that Johnny Ringo had previously threatened suicide. And if he did kill himself, some people will say that he took the coward's way out. But I'm not one of those people. Life's hard. Sometimes we face shit that seems impossible to overcome. And you find yourself alone with whatever bottle of booze or pills you have, with a head full of shit, pretty much trying to either figure it out or fall asleep. And sometimes in those dark moments, people choose to no longer play ball. They opt out. And that's what I'm thinking Johnny Ringo did. If you're in the same spot, stop. Don't kill yourself. If you're struggling, seek help. There's people you can reach out to. The suicide prevention people are always available at 1-800-273-8255. 1-800-273-8255. Get some sunlight in your life. They say that exercising helps. Whatever. No matter how low you think you are, there are people who care and who will miss you and will probably blame themselves if you take your own life. So before you pick up your gun, pick up your phone and give someone a call. Nothing lasts forever. The sun always rises in the morning. Okay, enough with the depressing shit. Ringo's buried near the base of the tree where his body was found. You can visit his grave, but it's on private property, so make sure you get permission first. So let's do a little more fact versus fiction when it comes to Tombstone. Remember that scene where Ringo and Doc speak Latin to each other? Throughout the entire movie, it's hinted at that Johnny Ringo was a very educated man. The real-life Johnny Ringo probably wasn't. There's no evidence that he got more than the basic schooling that everybody in Missouri got at that time. Doc Holliday, however, could speak Latin. He knew his letters, as they used to say. He was also well-versed in Greek and French, thanks to his time at the Valdosta Institute, a private school in Valdosta, Georgia. Was Ringo a fan of Shakespeare? I couldn't find out anything that would back that claim up, but it's entirely possible. Books were rare in the Old West. Oftentimes, people traveling west had to be very conscious of how much weight they were packing. A wagon can only hold so many supplies. So when it came to books, they chose very carefully. The Bible was brought west, of course, and the other books were those that stood the test of time, like the works of Shakespeare. Hell, even Jim Bridger, the illiterate mountain man, was a huge fan of Shakespeare. He supposedly kept one of his books on him, and anytime he was camped with somebody who could read, he'd have them read portions around the campfire. And I guess that's about all I have on Johnny Ringo. By the way, this topic was a suggested topic from a listener, so keep those suggestions coming. You can comment on YouTube, you can email me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com, or you can hit me up on the contact button at my website, bloodybeaver.com. A listener from Finland named Henrik recently reached out asking me about John Miller, one of the many men who claimed to be Billy the Kid. And I said I'd look into it and give my opinion on my next episode. So this is my next episode, Henrik, and I did look into it. There's not a lot out there about John Miller. So his story goes that Pat Garrett shot the kid, he turned his body over to local Mexican women to bury him, and these ladies, while preparing the body for a burial, found that Billy was still breathing. So they switched his body out with that of a Mexican man who died the day before, and they nursed Billy back to health. Once he was able to travel, he moved to El Moro, New Mexico, up in the northeast portion of the state. Supposedly he had a large pistol covered in notches, indicating the number of men he killed. As an old man, he showed people his supposed bullet wound scars. He also demonstrated how easily he could get his hands out of restraints, which Billy was known to have been able to do. He had a Mexican wife named Isadora who also claimed that Miller was Billy the Kid. And all of this seems to come from just one source, a book titled Ernst Albert Tietjen, Missionary and Colonizer by Gary Tietjen. That's Tietjen. So I'd seriously take all of it with a grain of salt. Sounds like John Miller was just another old timer telling stories. I was able to find one picture that's supposed to be Miller, and of course he looks nothing like Billy. Doesn't mean he was just a nobody though. I always compare this stuff to Vietnam veterans. Lots of dudes got sent to Vietnam, they served as cooks or mail clerks, stuff like that. They never fired a shot in combat, never stepped outside the wire. Then they got discharged, came back home, and all of a sudden people start making movies about Vietnam. Then their grandkids start asking questions. What you do in the war, Pawpaw? And all of a sudden they start making up stories. Like they were Rambo or some shit. I get it, you want to impress your family. But man, who cares if you were just a cook? That's honorable. You served your country. That's more than I ever did. You should be proud of just that. But for some people, that's just not enough. They want to fabricate stories, and I think that's the case here with Mr. John Miller. Also, this is just me, but if I was a notorious outlaw who just faked my death, I'd move much farther away. This dude didn't even leave the state. And basically, like all the other reasons I mentioned in my episode on Brushy Bill Roberts. If you want to dig further, I'd suggest check out the Census Records. Go to Ancestry.com. You can access it for free at your local library, or at least I can at mine. Make an account, find John Miller living in El Moro, New Mexico in the 1890 or 1900 census. Like I said, his wife's name was Isadora. And follow the trail. It should list a birth date, birthplace, etc. Also, he died in the 1930s, I believe, so he definitely has a death certificate, which should also be available online for free. These death certificates almost always list the name of the dead person's parents. Then you look them up on a census from like, say, 1870 or 1880. If you find a kid living with them named John, then boom, mystery debunked. I'm sure all of this has probably already been done. I just don't have the time to really dig too deep into it. Okay, so I jokingly mentioned the coronavirus last episode. As of this recording, things are getting crazy out there. Tom Hanks has corona. The NBA is shut down. Schools are shut down. And people are losing their fucking minds and buying up all the toilet paper they can find. So I thought I'd do another Bloody Beaver public service announcement. Listen, we haven't been using toilet paper as human beings for all that long. So what did people used to use back in the old West days? I'm lucky enough to have a father who grew up in a very poor, backcountry type place. They didn't have electricity until he was a teenager, no indoor plumbing. Hell, he wasn't even born in a damn hospital. He was born on the kitchen table. Seriously. The first 15 years of his life, other than having access to vehicles, he basically lived like people did in the era that I cover on this podcast. So I called him up and asked, what did y'all used to use for toilet paper in the outhouse? His reply? Corn cobs. You heard me. Corn cobs. You wiped with the yellow ones first, and then a white one to make sure everything was clean. They would also keep an old Sears and Roebuck catalog in there, for perusing as well as for wiping. You look for what you want to buy, and then you rip the page out and you wipe your little booty with it. A quick Google search verified that people did indeed used to wipe their anal regions with corn cobs. So there you have it, folks. Stop hoarding toilet paper and go load up on all that fresh corn. You can eat it and then clean with it later. Win-win. Okay, so that's it for this episode. Stay tuned for more to come. If you haven't already, hop over to YouTube and gently massage that subscribe button with your dominant finger. And then I want you to slowly slide it all over that button, just in a little circular motion. Yeah, just like that. A little bit faster. Not so rough, it's sensitive. All right, faster. Yeah. Now click the shit out of that like button. Whew. I need a cigarette. Hope all y'all stay safe during this global pandemic. Wash your damn hands. Stop coughing on people. Don't make any direct eye contact with midgets. And definitely don't kill yourself like Johnny Ringo did. Things can get rough, but there's always a tomorrow. To quote Shakespeare, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy. And to quote my crazy Uncle Joey Diaz, knock on your neighbor's door, spray some Febreze in her pussy, and get this party started. Peace out, y'all. Stay black.